Okay, it's 1 o'clock, so we will get going. Before we begin today's webinar, I want to acknowledge that Parachute's national office sits on what has been the ancestral land of the Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Anishinaabeg Nation, including the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation, since time immemorial to today. Hello and welcome everyone to today's webinar, conversation with Jessie Singer, author of the book, There Are No Accidents. Before we jump into our conversation, I wanted to let all of the participants know that this webinar will be recorded, so you can access it afterwards and we'll let you know when it's available, and that we welcome your questions. We will leave some time at the end of this conversation to ask your questions, and so please put them in the Q&A area of the Zoom meeting, and the link to purchase the book, we will post that in the chat as well. If you have any technical issues as well, just let us know in the chat. So to start, I wanted to give everyone some perspective about Canadian stats around injuries. From the 2021 Cost of Injury in Canada report, in 1 year, there were over 17,000 deaths, over 231,000 hospitalizations, and 4.6 million emergency department visits. In Canada, the injury rates were on a decreasing trend until 2001, and then they started rising slowly again. There's a noticeable jump in 2017, which may be due to opioid overdoses, and the rates have kind of fluctuated since that time. For many decades, there has been efforts to prevent injuries, and no doubt there has been improvements. We can thank those whose perseverance achieved changes like fire retardant clothing, seatbelts and airbags, and child-resistant caps on medicines. But even with those changes, preventable injuries remain the #1 cause of death for Canadians aged 1 to 44, and the third leading cause for all ages in Canada. And injuries cost our healthcare system $29.4 billion in 1 year. So I'm very excited to be speaking with Jessie today, our author of the book, There Are No Accidents, and we'll get into the use of that word. Jessie is a journalist whose writing appears in BuzzFeed, The Village Voice, The All, New York Magazine, The Guardian, and elsewhere. She currently serves as senior strategist and head writer at Transportation Alternatives, the editor-in-chief of Reclaim Magazine, and the founding editor of the International Vision Zero Cities Journal. Jessie's quest to find out why society often doesn't take effective action to prevent injury deaths has resulted in this landmark book, published this year, February 2022. As Jessie puts it, what we call accidents, the traffic crashes, the house fires, the falls and drownings, rarely register as a concern. Why are accidents so common? Why are accidents killing us more than ever? And why don't we talk about it? What can we do to stem the rising tide of death and life-altering injury? So welcome, Jessie, to this webinar.
Thank you so much for having me.
So pleased to have you. So injuries touch every person, whether they are injured themselves or someone in their family, their friends, their neighbors, coworkers even are injured. And those of us who work in the field of injury prevention are attracted to the goal of making the world a better place. We have a real social purpose. You also have a very personal connection to injury. Can you tell us what prompted you to write the book?
Sure. It's not a happy story that got me here. In 2006, my best friend, Eric, who was then 22 years old, was riding his bike on a segregated biking and walking path that runs up the west side of Manhattan. He was killed by a driver who mistakenly turned and entered that path and then drove down it. That man was drunk and speeding, and he went to prison. And while that moment affected my life more than anything ever has, what really started me on the path to writing this book occurred 11 years later, when a different man rented a truck and followed the same route as the man who killed my best friend, except this time, the person intentionally turned onto the path. He killed 8 and severely injured 11 in an act of vehicular terrorism. And it prompted me to look into the space where my best friend had died. And there I found that others had been killed before Eric and after Eric on the same path in almost the same way. Now, the drivers were different. The man who killed Eric was drunk, others were distracted, others were lost. But every time the story that was told was it was an accident and no problems were solved. After the terror attack, the city and state got together and made the recurrence of this harm impossible. And what it told me was that accident was this magic word of willful ignorance that allowed us to disregard preventable harm.
Yeah, it's, the numbers are, hide in some cases the human toll of a incident, an accident. And I know in the book you talk about the, a lot of these injuries happen in ones and twos, and so they don't get a lot of attention, whereas things that happen in much larger numbers, that's what attracted attention, and that seems to align well, unfortunately, with your experience in this particular area that you're talking about.
I think that's a really important point. We're tricked by scale. We're tricked by incidents that happen on an order of magnitude. And what I found, and this occurs throughout history, such to the point that Crystal Eastman, a journalist who was writing in 1909, points out that she did a massive study of worker deaths in injury-related worker deaths in Pittsburgh. And she pointed out that the vast majority of worker deaths occurred in ones and twos. But the only time anyone ever paid attention was when there was a massive mine collapse, killing hundreds at once. And we see that today, such as with like the Oceanside condo collapse. The only time we really pay attention to injury is when these big things occur. But 99% of people who die in these so-called accidents die, all alone, essentially, in these one-off instances. But those one-off instances add up to a massive toll. You mentioned the numbers in Canada. In the US, in 2020, more than 200,000 people were killed in unintentional injury-related deaths. And that number has risen 132% since 1992.
It's incredible, and I think those of us who work in the field just can't imagine why an issue of this magnitude doesn't get the kind of attention that it deserves, and that if you were looking at any other kind of death, it does get the attention that it deserves. So I want to focus a little bit on the word accident, because I know that a lot of us, and you address this in the book as well, about calling these accidents. But, we know that words matter. For decades, there's been efforts to try to eliminate this term accidents, because we know that if it's accidental, it's not predictable or preventable. There's nothing we can do about it. It's an act of fate. When we know, and I mean, in some ways, this is really good news, that we know how to predict and prevent these accidents from happening. And unlike some other health issues, we know what effective solutions are. You just illustrated one of them in telling us the story about what prompted the writing of the book. So in Canada recently, we at Parachute, we were successful in sort of taking many years of effort over the finish line to have our Canadian press guidelines make changes to direct media not to use the word accident, but only in relation to traffic and road crashes. This is a first step. It's certainly not far enough, but it is a first step. And so why do you think that terminology has been so difficult to change, or that mindset? And obviously this is not new. I mean, you just referenced a scenario from, the early 1900s, over 100 years ago. Why is the idea that there are no accidents so challenging to get any uptake on?
It's a great question. Before I answer it, I wanted to share that we've had a little bit of success in the US as well. I work with a group of people who've lost loved ones to traffic crashes, a group called Families for Safe Streets.
Mhm.
And when we first started to organize together, they started a campaign that we called hashtag Crash Not Accident, which they used to convince the Associated Press to decide to, I think the quote is, avoid using accident in cases of car crashes where negligence may be involved, which is pretty roundabout, but it is, it's a baby step.
Mhm.
But I think it's a great question about the word accident, because I think it's really tricky. All right, first and foremost, there are two definitions, dictionary definitions of accident, and they contradict with one another. So one is that an accident is a random event, and the other is that an accident is a harmful event, which means that once an accident is unpredictable but has a predictable outcome. So I mean, it's nonsense from the get-go. But another thing that's really tricky is that studies show that when we hear the word accident, we don't think of either of those definitions. We don't think of either dictionary definition. What we think is unintentional. And so it's evidence of something I point out in the book, which is that we're kind of hyper focused on individual blame. I think by our nature, I think especially in the US, and you have to tell me if you agree, in Canada, but like, so this idea of focusing on intentionality is really tricky, because it drives us to the wrong conclusions when we talk about these things. So we hear accident, we think unintentional, and we're already so far along the wrong path. Because to say something is unintentional, such as an accident, is both blame and blamelessness at once, right? Because it's a way of saying, like, you did it, but you didn't mean it, right? And it IDs a person associated with this injury. And this is what we get wrong about injury-related death. We focus on the last person who made a mistake, the person who was injured, or the last person who screwed up. And in that narrative, injury-related death seems random, because we're focusing on just what that last person did. And in that, we miss the layered causality, the stacked dangerous conditions that actually lead to harm. And in that, all of these opportunities for preventing that harm. And you asked especially why it's been so hard to give up. And, I think that blame paradigm has a lot to do with it. But I think the other thing is that accident makes us feel better. I think it's a comfort, because it's an easier explanation than the complicated layered causality that actually leads to injury-related death. It's an explanation that says, it was this one person's fault, but they're forgiven. It narrows in on that person. And it's a way to say, I identified what was wrong. It was this one person. Let's not think about this unpleasant thing that happened anymore. It's almost a way to allow ourselves to move on. And so, of course, we're in love with it, because horrible things happen all the time. And accident's kind of this magic word that lets us, like, take a break from the horror. But it makes a lot of sense to me that we've clung to it for so long.
Yeah, it sort of points to that underlying, psychological behavior, how we function as a human being, just generally, and this is applied specifically to incidents that cause injury. And one of the things we've noticed, especially in the traffic, crash area, road safety, is another language issue about talking about, like, the car hit the pedestrian without understanding that that car is driven by a person. Right. And so again, it's sort of not describing the issue or the incident correctly, but then it still doesn't address the issue that you've just talked about, which is the fact that that person is the last person to have made the wrong choice, the wrong decision, but that it's surrounded in much more complexity with the road that they're driving on, the type of vehicle that they have, the experience they have, et cetera. So I often get asked, what's the solution? And it's like, there's no one thing. It's a combination. And I think that's what makes it even more challenging, because when you talk about different injuries, it's a different approach because we're trying to take that evidence-based and solving or trying to avoid um, in situations from happening based on the evidence. But everyone would like them, as you say, the easy answer, the oh, it was an accident, we can't do anything. My other favorite one is that the whoever it was that was injured or died did it doing something they loved. So trying to mitigate the fact that this has happened.
Yeah, I think that's another story that gets told. And this was actually something I had to cut out of the book for space, but like the hero narrative, wherein
Yeah.
we kind of we valorize the innocent accidentally dead in this, almost obituary style news reporting of what had happened instead of like talking about the conditions of their
Mhm.
death. I saw this in the New York Times. There was a horrible story of a Holocaust survivor who used a wheelchair, who was killed crossing the street in New York City. And when the New York Times covered his story, they just told the story of his, hard, complicated life and the people who loved him, and like didn't talk about the fact that he was like struck in a crosswalk with the right of way while using a wheelchair. And like that has happened before in this intersection and would obviously happen again. So there's a lot of ways when we tell these different stories, we miss the critical information by focusing so much on individuals.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And there's more and more of that kind of conversation happening. There's kind of two approaches, I guess. It's the first, and we've been talking about that, taking the responsibility of the individual, that they need to make better choices or take responsibility, and that there's a personal failing that causes the injury. You talk about in the book about the nut behind the wheel and the accident prone worker. And I know we've talked, I mean, I've grown up hearing about, accident prone people like it's a genetic kind of disposition of why they experience so many injuries. But we know that injuries are not sort of equal opportunity. Those that have lower incomes or from ethnic or racialized groups, we know are higher risk of injury. In Canada, we don't, or we haven't collected data in that way. So we don't have a good data set to describe that. But you were able to do that in the book. We know that at the neighborhood levels, we know that injuries are higher in low socioeconomic neighborhoods. But can you talk a bit about the data that you were able to gather related to equity and sort of who pays the price, that uneven relationship between the individual and the corporate government, the people who are making systemic decisions?
Absolutely. So in the book, just for anyone who wants to dive deeper, I'm using US Centers for Disease Control data sets that come from cause of death coding, using the ICD-10
Mhm.
um, for from death certificates. And this was one of the things that really drove me to not just be so angry about what had happened to my best friend and the way it had repeated, even though it was so obviously preventable. But that convinced me that there was a much larger story to tell here. That when I looked at the numbers, and I had, before this, I had understood accidents the way we all do, that they're supposed to be random. And if that were true, injury-related death would fall randomly across the country, and it does not. And this is especially true for accidents where policy and infrastructure make a difference between life and death. The safety of homes, of roads, of workplaces. And in the US, accidental death is very strictly divided along racial and class lines, especially in these infrastructure and policy related forms of death. To give an example of what I'm talking about, pretty much everyone in the US dies of choking, of unintentional injury by asphyxiation from food at the same rate. And that's because there's no infrastructure or policy that's going to protect us differently on how fast we eat our food. But if you look at those forms of unintentional injury related death where infrastructure and policy do matter, you see stark differences. For example, Black people die in house fires at more than twice the rate of white people in the US. Indigenous people die from being struck by cars at more than twice the rate of white people in the US. People in West Virginia die by accident at more than twice the rate of people in Virginia, which is just across the state line. Which is to say that policy decisions and unregulated corporate power lead to risk unequally distributed across the US. And I think there's an important way to think about this. You know, we were just talking about how we often think of accidents as a matter of personal responsibility. You know, what she did wrong, what decision he made that I wouldn't have made the same way. And this is a way of comforting ourselves after seemingly random horror. It's a way of separating ourselves and being like, oh, that couldn't happen to me. And so we think of accidents in that sense as a matter of personal responsibility. But if you look at these numbers, it's actually a matter of risk exposure. And we are not all exposed to the same risk. And maybe there's some part of you, because I think this is really ingrained, that still wants to blame personal responsibility, that still wants to find that individual explanation. Something I've been pointing out to people is, so right now it's April, right? So it's April, and we could probably bet that almost everyone on this call has given up on their New Year's resolution. Now, that's a behavior that you wanted to change, which is just to say it's incredibly hard to change human behavior, especially behaviors that serve people, like, driving to work quickly, or, using a space heater when you're cold. So it points to this idea that even if these are matters of personal responsibility, it's the wrong path to follow to try and change the problem, a misleading distraction from our vast ability to solve the problem. For example, people in Europe are much less likely to die of unintentional injury-related death than people in the US. And like I said, people in West Virginia are more likely to die than people in Virginia, which is to say, are Europeans more responsible? Are West Virginians less responsible? No, they're exposed to different conditions. There's another example I've been bringing up lately that I think is super relevant right now in the US, because we're seeing all these advances in not driverless cars, but like basic autonomous safety technology, like automatic emergency brakes. And they're not required in the US in every car. In fact, you can only get them if you pay extra. And so you can imagine two drivers who are speeding. Those two drivers are making the same bad decisions, right? But one is rich and has paid $10,000 to get automatic emergency braking in his car. So for those two people, that bad decision that we might judge as a matter of personal responsibility are going to have two totally different outcomes. One is going to survive their mistakes and bad decisions, and the other is going to die because of their mistakes and bad decisions. And the only difference between those two people is their economic class, not the decisions they're making.
Yeah, and that, I think that example really stands out because it's been sort of that way for decades. We know that the more expensive vehicles have the safety features in them, or that have either been introduced and are only available on newer vehicles, or that you can pay to retrofit. So I think that example is a really good illustration of exactly two people making a very similar decision personally, but having very different outcomes. So, the other approach, and we've sort of started to touch on this, is, what happens at the societal level, the systems level, that humans are going to make mistakes. I think I heard you say that, people aren't perfect and we can't make them perfect. So the reality is that the environment plays such an enormous role in whether an injury occurs or not. So, a lot of the knee jerk or the first solution that people go to is education. If we just tell people what they need to know, they're going to do it, because if they know that this is what is causing an injury, they're going to stop. And I think there are a number of other public health issues, smoking, obesity, New Year's resolutions, what you just brought up, that it's not that people don't know what to do, but that when we look at sort of passive interventions like the seatbelt, the automatic braking, child resistant caps on medications, we see that really affecting the outcome because they make such a difference. And you draw some relationships between these disparate accidents, and the relationships. Can you expand a little bit more on what you wrote in the book on that?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, when we talk about accidental death, when we talk about injury related death, and I should caveat, I use the word accident in the book with this same disclaimer that I'm not sure for a general audience me policing wording is effective. What I do think is effective is people catching on themselves, and so I'm using the word accident here, and I use the word accident throughout the book because I want it to sound bad for you too. And so just with that caveat, when we talk about injury related death, what we're talking about is simply, and this is an idea of the first administrator of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, Dr. William Hayden. What we're talking about is dangerous energy. And the energy is different. It's kinetic energy in a traffic crash and electrical energy in a fire, right? But all unintentional injury related death is simply a unintentional interaction with more energy than the human body can withstand. And so much of what we need to do when we approach preventing injury is focus on preventing harm, essentially putting a pillow between us and our mistakes, because really that's all, say, an airbag or a seatbelt does. These are harm reduction devices, which is a phrase we often hear harm reduction is a phrase we often hear associated with drug use. A clean syringe or naloxone is a harm reduction device, but so is a seatbelt or an airbag or a fire sprinkler. And I'd like to point out, and this is something I get into in the book, that so a fire sprinkler doesn't prevent a child from playing with a lighter, right? It just prevents the worst harm that could occur when a child might play with a lighter. And by focusing on that, preventing the harm of our mistakes rather than somehow making us perfect and preventing us from making mistakes, we could save so many lives. But the sprinkler is a great example. It's not just that the sprinkler is a harm reducing device. So is the regulation, the government regulation that forces landlords to install the sprinkler, and forces contractors to install the sprinkler every time they build a new building. And so is the enforcement of that regulation, so that people are held to account. And this kind of gets at the inequities we're talking about in unintentional injury death, right? Because you're safer if you have more control over your environment. So if you can pay for the automatic emergency brake, you're safer because you control your environment. And so one of the reasons we see, for example, inequities in fire-related deaths is because if you're poor and if you're a person of color, you're less likely to have control of your environment. You're more likely to be a renter. And so you don't necessarily control the space where you live. We see the same thing in work deaths, that if you're more desperate for work, you might have to work in a more dangerous environment. You have less control over that space. And I think this is one reason we see larger corollaries like income inequality tracks with accidental death from like the Industrial Revolution to today. So when everyone has more money and more power, they're better able to control their own safety. And when only the wealthiest have all the money and the power, working people are less able to control their own safety.
And you talk quite a bit about the financial drivers of those kinds of decisions. So and only or most often when the financial reward and the safety reward line up. And I think it was in the railway example that you wrote about in your book, that when the safe choice was the best choice financially was when, that's what drove some of those decisions. I found that very, alarming in one way, and encouraging in another way, that and we talk quite a bit about, if we make the safe option the easy option, that makes it, that makes it just that more probable that we will get the intervention that we're looking for. So, the do you have any, I mean, as in the book, there's some examples of this, and maybe you want to talk a little bit about one or two of them, but that intersection between what um, you know corporate financial drivers have in terms of safety, and those systems that we're trying to impact.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when it comes down to it, corporations have a huge amount of power over whether or not we live and die, um, quote unquote, by accident. And we've seen this throughout history. You know, from the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory, which was the inciting event for the creation of workers' compensation and worker safety regulations in the US. Um, Work deaths declined with those regulations about the built environment of the workplace and workers' compensation, which put a cost on accidental worker deaths. There was suddenly, every time a worker died on your watch, it wasn't just an accident, it was a cost to your bottom line. And so work deaths declined. You know, air travel is the safest form of transportation because it's the most regulated. Child iron poisoning is a great example. You know, it was a pill that was packaged in a bottle. Children would take many of them, and there were countless deaths and injuries. There was new regulation that regulated blister packaging for those pills, and the deaths plummeted. The injuries plummeted. Anesthesia is another really specific example of putting a cost on accidental death and it changing the rate. Which was that people used to die under anesthesia in huge numbers. And then there were a series of tort cases suing hospitals over these. And it led to new rules about training and work hours for anesthesiologists. And those deaths plummeted. And I think an important thing to note is that, you know, we pay for this, corporations pay for this beforehand, or we all pay more later. And today, corporations, you know, in the US, we've seen such a pattern of deregulation and regulatory capture where corporations are able to externalize those costs. You know, and we pay for it. We pay for it in our healthcare costs, in road repair costs, in emergency services, and welfare that people, you know, are forced on in the aftermath of these tragedies. You know, and I think probably the most important thing to say is that we know how to solve injury-related death, but it's going to take a fight. You know, if you look at something like the collapsible steering column, which used to be a really common cause of injury-related death in traffic crashes, where people would crash and were impaled on the steering column. For a decade, the car companies owned the patent to a collapsible steering column, but they weren't putting it in their cars. They owned the patent. You look at something like airbags and naloxone, and if perhaps folks don't know, naloxone is a very simple drug, harmless to children, that arrests an accidental opioid overdose. Stops it completely, saves your life. Airbags were invented in the 1960s. Naloxone was invented in the 1960s. In the US, airbags weren't mandated in every car until 1998, and naloxone is still not mandated with every opioid prescription. So, you know, there is a fight required to kind of push corporations to, you know, account for accidental death, and, you know, not just focus on, oh, we're just going to prevent people from making mistakes. We're going to tell them not to crash their cars and tell them not to do drugs, and rather, you know, to force corporations to spend the money to prevent the harm when mistakes do occur.
Yeah, and as you were describing it, I mean, one of the challenges is that the costs are incurred in the healthcare system, and the, you know, of injuries and death, and the prevention costs are located in other sectors, which makes it, you know, again, more complex. But you know, going back to your workplace example, we've seen data on, you know, from the province of Ontario, where when they made the decision that workplace injuries were not acceptable, and they were costly. They put in priorities. They made it a priority. They funded it in terms of human and financial resources. There was some accountability towards it, and so there was reporting on it, and you just saw the numbers dive down. All other injuries basically have stayed the same. They've come down a little bit, but you can see just from that example such a stark reality in terms of when there is investment, there is success, and improvement, and when there's not, there's not. And that, I think that's those are some excellent examples of where we've done some good, and some improvements, and how we could see similar outcomes if we put our money where the issues are. You talked a bit about road safety and the collapsible steering column, and just how long it takes to get some of these things put into place. The safe systems approach, I think that's what a lot of us in injury prevention, in particular, and road safety, like about the safe systems, the complete streets, vision zero approach, is that it is taking that systemic environmental approach to road crashes and the designs of road and vehicles, and much less so on that individual person choices. Can you talk about what you feel has been done well in this area in road safety, and a little bit about what we haven't done as well? Maybe it is some of the things that you've mentioned about not implementing things that we know work soon enough. But can you talk a bit about road safety, because I know that this is an area that you've done a lot of work with, and with Families for Safe Streets as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And the example you brought up about the gains we've seen in the workplace are actually a really interesting example, because it's a location that we've all socially accepted that the employer is responsible, that you're on their turf, you're on their clock, they're responsible. And that's what really changed the paradigm, right? And I think with a lot of these other areas of accidental death, we see kind of a Wild West approach that, again, looks at personal responsibility, like you're behind the wheel, not you're in a car that was built by Chrysler. And you're on a road that was designed by this municipality. And I think that that's kind of the paradigm shift. And so in the places that have actually implemented a safe systems approach towards Vision Zero, places like Sweden, we see an acceptance of that responsibility. That we're turning away from looking at people and turning towards what those with the power to protect people are doing. And where we've seen those huge gains are essentially fall on this, back to this energy idea I was talking about earlier, places that separate fragile people from harmful energy. And I think it's important to note that, like on the roads, that separation could be quite literal, say a bollard protected bike lane or sidewalk, but it can also be more figurative, such as extensive public funding of transit, which is safer than driving. So fewer people are moving these independent energy machines around the road, and there's one professional driver moving that energy machine down the road. So, I mean, I think we've seen a lot of advancements there. Another thing we see in those places, and in much of the Europe and Japan, is the regulation of the size and power of vehicles and their safety features, right, to protect people inside and outside the vehicle. Like right now in the US, we're seeing a massive rise in traffic fatalities, but an even bigger and faster rise in pedestrian fatalities, because we have made vehicles larger, more powerful, heavier, and have totally failed to regulate them for pedestrian safety. So they have higher hoods, the impact is more likely to be a head and chest impact instead of a body impact. And so the numbers are skyrocketing. And so again, it's a combination of the municipalities and the government controlling corporations around the product, with a focus on reducing the power of that energy and the harm of that energy. Mm-hmm. Speaking of where it's not been done well, in the US, we've said the words Vision Zero a lot. And recently, the federal government has also started to say the word safe systems, and um, we haven't seen a lot of actually doing it. We've seen wasting huge amounts of money on PSAs. We really like PSAs. We've seen wasting a lot of money on police enforcement. What are known as sort of bad apple theory solutions. The idea being that the problem of traffic deaths isn't roads designed for speeding or giant vehicles that keep getting heavier and more powerful, but bad people, jaywalkers, nuts behind the wheel, these age-old paradigms of individual responsibility. In the US, we've declined to regulate automakers to a massive degree, including, making vehicles safe for pedestrians. And the results have been really predictable and horrifying.
So turning that a little bit on its head, how can individuals, and you've worked, you talked about safe families for safe streets. We have a similar group or groups in Canada. How can we as individuals take action to influence the system? So to draw attention to the effectiveness of environmental changes as individuals. So not putting the responsibility for their own safety on the individuals, but how can we as individuals and community groups really get those people who have the decision making power to make the better decisions and faster implementation?
I think it's a tricky question, and it's a tricky question for this audience a little. But my two big picture solutions that I usually put forth to U.S. audiences, and it's a little tricky in Canada because I know often you're using U.S. products but don't necessarily have the ability to advocate for these things. But since we don't know our audience, the most important things we can do on the federal level are reviving and refunding the regulatory agencies that are supposed to protect us from corporations and their ability to injure us. From the OSHA to NHTSA to the EPA, these organizations have the ability to force corporations to pay money when they fail to protect us, when they put us at risk, and giving them back power is hugely important. One of the things I point out is that accidental death in the US starts to rise in 1992, a few years after President Reagan dismantled and defanged our regulatory agencies and dismantled the social safety net. So that's no coincidence. And that gets to my other big picture point, which is building up social safety nets, which I think is much stronger in Canada than it is here, are incredibly important to preventing unintentional injury death, because it allows people to afford to better protect themselves. When we have a social safety net, you don't have to live in the most dangerous apartment. When you're not starving, you can, not take the most dangerous job. You could maybe buy a safer car. And so I think that's an important duality. But I also think that there's so much, because those are big intractable systems like the federal government, there's so much that can be done locally. And you said this earlier. The thing that gives me the most hope about the accidental death crisis is that accidents are simple. It's not COVID, it's not cancer. We know how to do this. We know how to reduce harm. And there's a million ways that you can prevent accidental death in your community. Like you can advocate for traffic calming in your city and public transit expansions in your exurbs and your suburbs, so that people are less likely to have to drive and more likely to be driven by a professional driver and therefore better protected. You can fight for safe injection sites and the free and regulated distribution of naloxone, so that taking drugs doesn't have to be a death sentence. You can fight for ADA accessibility, like ramps and grab bars, so that an accidental fall isn't a trip to the hospital, but the harm is mitigated. Fire safety requirements like sprinklers and self-closing doors reduce the likelihood of injury-related death. A life-guarded pool instead of a swimming hole that's unprotected reduces the likelihood of injury-related death. So there's a million ways you can tackle these issues locally by simply building harm reduction into your own community.
That's, and I think that concept about harm reduction aligns well with parachutes and our philosophy about, we want people to engage in life, in their activities. We want them to live a long life, and we want them to do these things over and over again. And the way that they do that is to prevent, the serious and life-ending kind of injuries. And that doesn't necessarily, that doesn't mean that they themselves are responsible for them, but that there's ways to take action. And when we published the cost of injury in Canada report last year, we recognized that there was significant potential for change. And we're, as you are, and as you've described, is I'm optimistic. And after being in this sector for 20 years and seeing some good, but definitely not fast enough change, I'm still optimistic that there is significant potential for change. So I know we have some questions coming up, so I'll ask my last question, then we'll go to the audience. But how do you want your book to drive injury prevention efforts in the future?
Absolutely. I often cite the work of a workplace safety expert named Sidney Decker. He breaks the problem down of how we view injury-related death into what he calls the bad apple theory, which I mentioned earlier, and the new view. So the bad apple theory is that we die by accident because of bad apples. There's just a few bad apples and it's all their fault. They either cause the deaths or they kill themselves. And he advocates for what he calls the new view, which is the idea that if people are being injured, then the system is unsafe. It's an indicator light that the systems are unsafe. And so essentially the bad apple theory is a way of saying that injury is a people problem. And the new view is a way of saying it's a systems problem. And so if you believe in the bad apple theory, your solution is to change people, fire them, retrain them, automate them, fix them. And if you believe in the new view, the solution is to change the system. And to change the system, I think we need to view the problem from the lowest common denominator. And there's a phrase, I'm quoting an epidemiologist named Dr. Sue Baker here. There's a phrase she writes that she thinks we should make the world safe for drunks. Because if you make it safe for drunks, you make it safe for people who are distracted because their kids got an operation, from people who are sleepy because they had to work a double shift. When you make the world safe for drunks, you make it safe for everyone by default. And in doing so, you abandon blame as a solution. And I think that's my biggest hope, is that I would like us to abandon blame as a solution and abandon the idea that people are perfectible. And with that, and I think this is an important thing to note, is to take the racial and economic disparities in injury-related death as a mandate for that change, that they are a requirement of why we must abandon blame as a solution, because they prove that that is neither the problem or the answer.
Or the answer. Wow, that's abandon blame. I like that. I like that. And people are not, as much as we'd like to believe we're perfect, we are definitely not. So I'm going to invite Kelly to join us. I know she's been watching the questions that have been coming in, and to help us hopefully answer all of the questions. We've got just over 10 minutes. So Kelly, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jessie, for all your insight today. So Edward asked the question, would it help to recognize and promote companies that do the right thing? And he seems to recall that the patent holder for the seatbelt, for instance, let other companies use it for free. So is there a way of, let's call it the carrot method, of rewarding good behavior among those corporate people who hold so much power?
I'm not sure about the seatbelts thing. I think it was Hugh DeHaven, who's in my book, who's an amazing man, who held the patent for the seatbelt, but he didn't work for a car company. But I think you make a really important point, because you do see the occasional great actor. Early in the Industrial Revolution, like US Steel was a great example. They prioritized safety, and accidental death rates of their workers plummeted, and they became a model for, the nation. And today, Volvo is an interesting example, because they really do focus on pedestrian safety in their cars. Of course, so I think we should lift those companies up, but The problem is that always leaves so much room for the lowest common denominators, for the worst actors, like Ford with their Pinto with its exploding gas tank, where they calculated that it would cost less to pay out the civil suits for people injured in crashes with their exploding gas tank car than it would to fix the car, so they didn't fix the car. So I think it's totally helpful to lift up companies that are doing good, but the only way to actually protect people is with regulations that force corporations to fall in line.
Okay. I've got a couple questions from Irene regarding pedestrian safety, and she talks about the focus sometimes on teaching people to walk properly, shaming and blaming, she calls it. If we emphasize pedestrians must be visible, is that part of this dynamic of sort of pointing toward that individual blame? She also quotes something which you may have come across from the Governor Highway Safety Administration report of 2020, says that 75% of all pedestrian deaths in the US take place at night or in low light conditions. So sort of that statistic around when pedestrian deaths happen, how can we shift that short of telling people to not walk at night?
Or the one I hear a lot and mock a lot is telling people to carry flashlights. Pedestrians, if you're going to go for a walk at night, you have to carry a flashlight. And so we're talking about like a paradigm here that puts the onus of safety and responsibility on the most vulnerable, the person most likely to be killed or injured, which is not only wildly unfair, but also sort of ridiculous. Especially, again, it's 2020, we have the technology to solve this problem. Pedestrian automatic braking exists, it works great, and it's not in every car. Why not? So I think we not only need to, I know the Governor's Highway Traffic Safety Administration report that you're talking about, and I find these analyses to be so problematic because often the same analysis doesn't note what the driver was doing. The person, in control to some extent of all of that powerful energy, when this pedestrian was struck at night. And this is, again, why we have to take a systems approach. Like, how do you prevent pedestrians from being stuck at night? Another reason, statistic about those fatalities are they happen in places without sidewalks, without crosswalks, without traffic lights, without proper lighting. So like anything that turns to an individual and asks them to be responsible, when we can systematize the space around them and make the space around them safe and protective, is at best a distraction from the responsibility of corporations and our government to protect us.
So Tobin has an interesting question, taking us off in a little different direction. He says, do you see any opportunities to advance injury prevention work by connecting it to climate change?
Sorry, can you say that again?
Yes, to connect injury prevention work by connecting it to climate change.
Oh, I as I was finishing the book, I couldn't stop thinking about this because of a few things that happened. I live in New York City, and as I was finishing the book, Hurricane Ida, notably a hurricane that started all the way in Louisiana, made landfall in New York City and caused such extensive flooding that people drowned in their basement apartments. And that would be what's classified in the US as an accidental death. But it's an accidental death that by no question is anything but a consequence of climate change. And so when we're looking at this catastrophic rise in accidental death in the US, I think we have to be counting the ways that we're not seeing climate change as a result of these. Another thing scary pattern we've been seeing is a series of extremely bad, large-scale traffic crashes at the California and Texas borders, wherein people driven by emergency migration, driven no doubt by climate change, are packed into vehicles, 25 in one SUV at some point, racing across the border. And what that is an accidental death driven by climate change and emergency migration. And I don't think we're counting those in the right way. So I don't know if the fight for injury-related death can be helped by the fight for climate change, but I think the problems are inextricable.
Someone else also mentions around the fact that we've been talking a bit about the responsibility of corporations, as she says. We have elections coming up here. How have you seen successes, failures, any advice on getting this issue on political radars, on making changes of political adoption of injury prevention strategies?
It's a hard question because outside of the people in this room, no one talks about injury prevention. They talk about topics, right? They'll talk about drug deaths or traffic deaths, maybe work deaths. They'll talk about these things topically. When many of the solutions, like a regulatory framework, are, truly systemic, like rules that address all corporations and their responsibility for harm. So I don't know if I have any more solutions for that, except that most people engage in politics, just like these politicians, based on issue areas. So if you can use the framing that we presented here today, the framing that leaves behind blame and focuses on safe systems, that looks towards harm reduction instead of mistake prevention. If you can frame every issue area that you chase with a politician based on that framing, then we might be able to start to shift the mindset so that people can see the interconnectedness between this and ways to build safety systems that occur across issue areas.
Okay. I've got a very specific question here from someone who they see safety infractions. They know how things should be done, for instance, in construction. The example used it's quite a long question, but it's about roofing. So if you see something and you see that, here's workers that are not being properly protected, there are rules in place, but how does an individual help to enforce, or how do you help these workers by letting them know what they should be protected by?
Well, I think, I would, remember that blame and responsibility is a power ladder. So I would always go to the top. You can, you want to focus your energy not necessarily on the rights of individual workers, which can be a complicated territory if you're not one of those workers, but on the regulatory agencies that are required to, make that owner and those, the people who own that company who are profiting from unsafe labor responsible. So, I don't know exactly in Canada, but in the US, I would recommend contacting OSHA to report the situation. And contacting your local elected officials to report the situation, and framing it exactly the way the question answer does, that there are people who are responsible for this. They're profiting from this unsafe situation. How can we help these workers? And I think that's an important point. One thing we've seen in the US is a rise in accidental fall deaths in the construction industry. And there's a direct corollary between the number of immigrants working in the construction industry, which is rising, and the likelihood of an unsafe workplace if you are an immigrant. There are very similar construction places, and ones that are hiring more immigrant labor are also less safe and less likely to follow these rules.
Yeah.
Just a couple more to wrap up. You in the book you talk about the Swiss cheese metaphor. I found that a very powerful analogy. So maybe you could share that with the folks who are on the call today.
Absolutely. It's a little hard. I would love to draw you a picture, but so the Swiss cheese analogy was invented by a psychologist named James Reason to help understand how large scale accidents occur, like 3 Mile Island or the Exxon Valdez running aground. And essentially what it says is that big complicated systems like that are like a stack of Swiss cheese. Each slice of Swiss cheese is a safety system, like an alarm or a warning bell or a life vest to throw overboard. And each of those safety systems has the potential for failure. That's the holes in the Swiss cheese. And when these big accidents occur, there's an alignment, a trajectory where, ideally, if one safety system fails, the accident passes through one hole in the Swiss cheese and slams right into the next one. It's arrested. But that occasionally all the holes line up. And that's how you get these cascading failures that lead to these really large scale accidents. What I ask people to do in the book is to take the Swiss cheese model and blow it up to outside the walls of a factory or a nuclear power plant or, an oil tanker, and to look at these systems not just as tangible safety systems like a seatbelt or an alarm, but as our social systems. Like if you are living in poverty, you have more holes in your Swiss cheese than someone who's not. You will have a greater likelihood of falling into that trajectory of accidental death. And so I think it's important to the lessons there are that the causes of accidents, whether they're big like 3 Mile Island or the Exxon Valdez, or small like a traffic crash, are layered. And those layers are, the age of your car and the safety of your car and the design of the road you're on. And whether or not those layers are present for you and solid or present and full of holes is often a matter of who you are and the risks that you're exposed to.
Yeah, the Swiss cheese model is always, the idea of it is so easy to understand, how those layers, we talk about them as layers of protection, how they either align or misalign to and you often hear people in news stories or that say, well, if only I had replaced the tire, that the tire didn't blow, or if only the weather wasn't so poor, or that hole in the road, pothole had been repaired, this wouldn't have happened. It's that sort of stacked kind of events that lead up to that major catastrophic outcome. Kelly, is there any more? We're just, I know we're at time.
And one last thing in your story, Jessie, about how Eric died. And then when there was a terrorism act, suddenly the solution happened. But what was that solution? What did they do to that parkway to make that never happen again?
This is a great example. It's a bike and pedestrian path that runs alongside a major highway. And there are driveways where drivers can cross the path to get to parking lots and whatnot on the other side. And so every time things went wrong, a driver, instead of just crossing the path, turned onto it. The solution wasn't prison or a PSA. They just put a bollard at every single entrance. They just prevented the harm from occurring. Just a big steel bollard, so you physically could not drive a car into the pathway. They barricaded every entrance and no one else died.
I think that's an excellent example to end on of how really straightforward some of these solutions can be. So my sincere thanks, Jessie, for you taking the time to talk to us. I know we probably had more questions than we had time for. So I would encourage everyone to go out, grab a copy of There Are No Accidents. We've put the link in the chat. I've read the book twice. I know Kelly's read it a couple of times. And it really has a lot of excellent information and just good reminders, even for those of us who've worked in this area for a long time, of, really the foundations on which prevention should be built. So thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you.